In the late 1960s, Northern California was locked in a kind of fear that felt impossible to contain. It wasn't just that a killer was striking without warning. It was that he wanted everyone to know he was out there. He wrote letters. He sent ciphers. He mocked police. He called newspapers. And he gave himself a name that would become one of the most infamous in criminal history. Zodiac.
More than 50 years later, the Zodiac killer case is still one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. There were witness descriptions, physical evidence, coded messages, decades of investigation. And still, no one has ever been definitively proven in a court of law to be the Zodiac killer. So who was he? How many people did he really kill? And how does a case this notorious stay officially unsolved for so long? In this video, we're breaking down the timeline of the Zodiac case. The confirmed attacks, the letters and ciphers, the strongest suspects, and why this mystery still refuses to die.
The story is generally believed to begin on December 20th, 1968. That night, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen were parked on Lake Herman Road, a lonely stretch near Benicia, California. It was a quiet lover's lane, the kind of remote road where teenagers often went for privacy.
Sometime between 11 o'clock and 11:15 p.m., they were attacked. Faraday was shot once in the head at close range, inside or near the car. Jensen seems to have tried to run. Her body was found outside the vehicle. She had been shot multiple times in the back.
There were no immediate answers. The attack was brutal, sudden, and it seemed to have no motive. Robbery wasn't the goal. There was no obvious personal connection. And at the time, investigators had no way of knowing this double murder might be part of something much bigger. A much larger nightmare. For months, the case stayed what it looked like then. A tragic and baffling double homicide.
Then, on July 4th, 1969, it happened again. Shortly before midnight, 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin and 19-year-old Michael Mageau were sitting in a parked car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. It was only a few miles from the first crime scene. Another car pulled up nearby, then drove away. A short time later, it came back.
The driver got out and walked to the passenger side. He was carrying a flashlight and a 9mm handgun. At first, Mageau reportedly thought it might be a police officer. It wasn't. The man opened fire into the car. Then, after hearing screams and movement, he came back and fired again. Ferrin was killed. Mageau survived, despite severe injuries.
This attack gave investigators something they didn't have the first time: a living witness. Mageau described the shooter as a white male, heavy-set, with a large face, roughly in his mid-20s to early 30s. But here's the thing: witness descriptions in this case would change over time and stay frustratingly imprecise.
The biggest development came less than an hour later. At 12:40 a.m., someone called the Vallejo Police Department from payphone. The caller calmly reported the crime, and then said something chilling. He also claimed responsibility for the Lake Herman Road murders from the previous December.
Just like that, investigators weren't looking at isolated murders anymore. They were hunting a serial offender.
Then the letters started. On August 1st, 1969, 3 nearly identical letters arrived at 3 Bay Area newspapers: the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. Each one claimed responsibility for the shootings. Each included 1/3 of a 408 symbol cipher, and the writer made a threat. Print the ciphers on the front page, or there would be more violence.
The letters included details that had never been made public. That convinced investigators they were probably real. Then, on August 7, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner. It opened with the words,
"This is the Zodiac speaking."
That was the first time the killer used the name that would define the case.
The 408 symbol cipher was eventually cracked by Donald and Betty Harden, a schoolteacher couple from Salinas, California. And honestly, the message was disturbing, just not in the cinematic way many people expected. It read more like a rambling declaration. The writer said he liked killing people because it was so much fun. He said murder was better than killing wild game in the forest. He also claimed his victims would become his slaves in the afterlife. Notably, the cipher did not reveal his identity.
And that became the pattern. The Zodiac kept communicating constantly. But whether he was telling the truth, lying, or mixing the two on purpose was never fully clear.
Then came Lake Berryessa. And things got even stranger. On September 27, 1969, Zodiac attacked again. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing near Lake Berryessa in Napa County. It was daytime. Peaceful. Normal. Then a man approached them wearing an executioner-style hood and a black bib-like costume marked with a white cross circle symbol. The now famous Zodiac emblem.
He told them he was an escaped convict. He said he needed money and a car to get to Mexico. Then he bound them with pre-cut lengths of clothesline. After tying them up, he pulled out a knife and stabbed them repeatedly. Hartnell survived. Shepard survived at first too. She was able to describe what happened. But later, she died from her injuries.
This attack was different from the shootings. It was more theatrical, more intimate, and somehow even more terrifying. The costume suggested planning, and the need to create an image. Almost like the killer was building a character for the public. After the attack, he walked to Hartnell's car and wrote a message on the door in black marker. It listed the dates of the previous attacks. December 20th, 1968, July 4th, 1969, and September 27th, 1969. And it was signed with the Zodiac symbol. That same evening, a man called police from a payphone to report the stabbings.
At that point, Zodiac wasn't just a murderer anymore. He had become a media-made nightmare. A killer who seemed to understand exactly how to turn fear into spectacle.
Then came the murder that is widely accepted as the final confirmed Zodiac killing. October 11, 1969. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver, picked up a passenger in San Francisco's Theater District. The passenger directed him to the wealthy Presidio Heights neighborhood. When they reached Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger shot Stein in the head with a 9mm handgun.
Then, in a detail that became central to the case, the killer tore away a piece of Stein's blood-stained shirt before leaving the cab. This murder was seen by 3 teenagers in a nearby house. They called police and described the suspect as a white adult male. That mattered later, because an early police broadcast reportedly described the suspect incorrectly as a black male. And that mistake may have allowed the killer to slip away during the first search.
A patrol officer may even have crossed paths with the suspect and didn't stop him because of that bad description. If that's true, it was one of the most painful near misses in criminal investigative history.
Soon after, Zodiac mailed letters to the press containing pieces of Paul Stein's shirt. That proved beyond doubt that the writer and the killer were the same person. This was a turning point. He had gone from attacking people in secluded areas to killing in San Francisco itself. And he was getting bolder. He threatened school buses. Claimed he would target children. And with every new letter, he pushed public panic even higher.
Over the next several months and years, Zodiac sent more letters and cards. Some were authenticated. Some were disputed. He used misspellings, strange phrasing, symbols, and threats. He seemed to enjoy controlling the story. One reason this case became so legendary is that it mixed homicide investigation with code-breaking, media manipulation, and public terror. Zodiac wasn't just hiding from capture. He was performing.
One of the most famous messages was the 340-character cipher, mailed in November 1969. For decades, it stayed unsolved. That fed all kinds of theories. That it contained his name, or some final secret. Then, in 2020, a team of civilian codebreakers finally cracked it.
The result was less revealing than many hoped. It included statements about not being afraid of the gas chamber because it would send him to paradise sooner. And it repeated more of the same talk about collecting slaves for the afterlife. Once again, there was no clear identification.
And that's one of the most frustrating parts of the Zodiac case. His messages made him famous. But they never conclusively exposed him. Depending on which claims you believe, Zodiac may have committed more than the 5 murders and 2 attempted murders officially tied to him. He himself claimed to have killed as many as 37 people. Investigators have never confirmed that number. The canonical Zodiac victims are generally considered to be David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein. The 2 known survivors are Michael Mageau and Brian Hartnell.
So who did it? Over the decades, countless suspects have been named. But one name has dominated public discussion more than any other. Arthur Lee Allen.
Allen became a major suspect for several reasons. He lived in California. He had access to weapons. And he reportedly made disturbing statements. Some people who knew him described behavior that raised red flags. At one point, he was said to own a Zodiac brand watch with a crosshair-like symbol, similar to the killer's emblem. There were also claims that Allen had talked about wanting to call himself Zodiac. And get this. There were claims he spoke about using a flashlight attached to a gun to blind victims before shooting them. Those details sounded eerily close to the crimes.
But after years of scrutiny, investigators still never had enough to charge him. Fingerprints did not conclusively match. Handwriting comparisons were not definitive. DNA evidence, limited as it was, did not firmly place him as the killer. Allen died in 1992. Still the most publicly discussed suspect, but never legally tied to the murders.
Other suspects have included Lawrence Kane, Rick Marshall, and several lesser-known people put forward by independent researchers, former detectives, and authors. Every theory has believers. And every theory has holes. That's the curse of this case. Almost every promising lead eventually collapses under the weight of uncertainty.
So why was the Zodiac killer never definitively identified? First, the crimes happened across multiple jurisdictions. Vallejo, Napa County, San Francisco, and others. In the late 1960s, coordination between departments was nowhere near as streamlined as it is today. Information moved slower. Systems were less connected. Second, forensic science was limited. There was no modern DNA profiling at the time of the murders. Fingerprint analysis, handwriting comparison, ballistics, and witness identification all had serious limits, especially when evidence was partial or contaminated. Third, Zodiac seemed to understand how to lower his risk. He attacked in low-visibility situations, usually at night or in isolated places. Even when there were witnesses, the descriptions were broad enough to fit a lot of men. Fourth, some of his letters may have included false claims. if investigators spent time chasing murders he didn't commit. That would have spread out focus and resources. And finally, now here's the thing. Zodiac built a mythology around himself. The symbol, the ciphers, the costume, the letters, all of it turned the investigation into something bigger than a normal homicide case. Every clue became a puzzle. Every suspect looked like a possible answer. And every answer created even more doubt.
The Zodiac killer's impact went far beyond the confirmed victims. He changed how Americans thought about serial crime, media attention, and anonymous terror. His case inspired books, documentaries, films, amateur investigations, and endless debate. Even now, law enforcement agencies still revisit the case using newer forensic techniques. Cold case investigators continue examining physical evidence, including letters and envelopes, hoping DNA technology might someday provide a definitive break.
But there are real problems. Old evidence degrades. Contamination is hard to rule out, and some items may never have been handled directly by the killer at all. That leaves the public in a strange place, close enough to speculate but never close enough to know. Was Zodiac acting alone? Did he stop on his own? Did he die, get imprisoned for another crime, or simply change his methods? Was the most famous suspect actually guilty? Or just an unsettling man who happened to match parts of the story?
That's why this case still endures. It isn't just unsolved. It resists closure.
More than half a century later, the Zodiac killer still stands as a symbol of unfinished justice. 5 confirmed dead. 2 known survivors. Dozens of letters. Multiple ciphers. Countless suspects. And still, no final answer.
For true crime, that uncertainty is exactly what makes this case so compelling. And so disturbing. Because unlike a closed case, the Zodiac mystery never gives you the relief of certainty. It leaves fragments. A hooded figure by a lake. A blood-stained shirt in an envelope. A coded message in a newspaper. And a name no one can prove.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most notorious cold cases, let us know your theory in the comments. Do you think Zodiac was Arthur Lee Allen? Someone else entirely? Or a suspect the public has barely considered? And if you want more unsolved true crime stories, cold case breakdowns, and criminal investigations, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.